Okay, so we're at the other side of this. I just want to explain a little bit, for Juliette's sake and for Sam's sake, but also for anybody that might be watching this now or on a recording. This is all fueled for a book that myself and Dr. Amy Redmond are writing in terms of the digital transformation of the real estate industry, and in particular sort of a focus around the drivers of change and what's going on. So those of you who followed these interviews will know that before Christmas and into this year, we've really been interviewing leaders on a one-to-one basis, looking at forms of innovation, forms of technology, forms of the drivers of change. And sustainability has been a continual protagonist, both in the conversations I've had, but also in the wider discussions in all of the conferences that I've had the pleasure of attending for a number of years now. And as a consequence, when it comes to the drivers of change, I've wanted to bring groups of people together so that we can actually sort of ideate around some of the thoughts that they've all got, because there are very, very broad opinions around those drivers. And so it gives me great pleasure just to bring in here Sam Pickering and Juliette Morgan to have this sort of first of the small sort of roundtables that we're going to be having. Just as a starting point, Juliette, can you start just by a small basis of introduction in terms of what you're doing with Gensler and further beyond that as well? And then perhaps, Sam, I can come to you straight after that, if that's all right.
Sure, thanks. I'm a principal at Gensler. I co-lead a global climate action sustainability practice. Gensler is the world's largest design firm. We design about 1.5 billion feet a year, anything from cities to airports to hospitality to logistics. We have 36 different practice areas designing the world into being. So my team look after the certification and life cycle assessment and sustainability strategy associated with those developments. In the rest of my life, I'm doing a degree in ecological design thinking, and that's quite an interesting thing to be doing alongside corporate ESG. So I'll probably leave it at that and hand over to Sam.
Very good. Thanks, James. Yes, so Sam Pickering. I'm an exec director at the Incedium Group, and I head up the sustainability advisory practice and also sustainability across the wider group. From an advisory perspective, we're basically assisting flex operators, landlords, and predominantly in my past occupiers, so major corporates, on achieving and building programs around whatever sustainability targets they might have set, be it net zero, science-based targets, and so on and so forth. And we either help them to implement that or help them set that, and then their supply chain takes over. And from an Incedium Group perspective, we're one of the largest flex aggregators of space in the world, and we are moving to look at how office space and transform the way office space is consumed by occupiers such as ourselves, but obviously major corporates as well, and further information will come during this year actually. And it's a really exciting time. And my take on this is that the world of real estate is very slow to move towards a sustainable future. And I think we're an exciting pivoting point that Flex, I think, will provide a major opportunity for that change.
Yeah, and that Flex journey, I think I'm really interested to actually sort of come back to afterwards, because I know you gave me a really interesting angle on that last week when we talked, which I hadn't considered about actually Flex being quite a driver of some issues that we've got to counter. Just to start with, and this is really directed at you, Juliette, for obvious reasons. One of the things that I very much appreciate in all of these conversations is actually very honest and to the point opinions. And really, Juliette, that's why I've got you on, because there's probably only, I would guess, 2 or 3 people globally that I've always admired, because you do not beat around the bush and you say exactly what you think about the issues. And you're one of them, and Josh Pankin is the other. In terms of a absolutely brutal is probably not the right word, but a very, very honest perspective on exactly what the industry is doing and is not doing. And there's no fluff, which I've always admired, because there's not many people, me included. I always try and look at the sort of the shiny bit, but actually, you're always very to the point. So, Juliette, can I just start with you in terms of, I sort of open this up with a point about me feeling that the built environment is finally waking up to innovative practices, and one of those reasons is because of sustainability being a significant driver of that shift. Finally, the leadership has been given a reason for them to have to change, and I just want to challenge my opinion on that, because it's very easy for me to make that opinion. I just want your perspective of whether that is actually accurate, or are there other drivers which are making the real estate industry or the built environment change, or actually are they changing? Have we got a long way to go? So there's probably three bits of questions in there. Challenge me on one. I'll take that. Number two is, are there any drivers? Any other drivers? Number three is it really changing, or am I just in a bubble of seeing it in conferences where everyone's talking about it but not everyone's doing it? There you go.
It's absolutely changing. So I'm going to take it backwards. I'm so refreshed by the fact that people don't question it anymore. That it's now every conversation, everybody, all the time. And I don't think I'm in an echo chamber. I think that's genuinely what's going on. So if I cast my mind back to the summer of 2018 and Greta Thunberg and London being shut down by Extinction Rebellion, an awful lot of people scratching their heads saying, what's this really about? I think the pandemic focused attention. I think contraction in occupancy and having to look at EPC ratings on buildings has really focused attention on sustainability as something that occupiers are interested in and reporting on, and need for talent attraction and retention. And the finance industry will not loan without good sustainability criteria. So yes, everybody's woken up to it, and I think they've woken up to it for wanting to feel that they've got good lives reasons, and also because all the drivers are coming from the finance end, whether that's the occupational end or the financing end. So I think that answers two of your questions, maybe all of your questions.
It does, and I do want to come back onto that important point about the finance industry not lending, because that's something I'm hearing a lot about, and I'm also hearing about it from the insurance side as well, which is even insurers are now also getting involved. But just picking up your point about COVID, Sam, have you got any opinions about that in terms of where you've seen it from your perspective? Has COVID also been a driver in terms of looking at these sorts of initiatives, or are you seeing it again slightly differently?
No, I think Juliette sort of summarises. There was a massive shift just before COVID, as you say, because financial markets started to evaluate this properly. I think post-COVID, it's given a big opportunity. And I think this is where we're at a slight inflection point, because there's that sudden realization that everyone's got too much space, and that consolidation of space across all of the clients we're working with. There's always a lens of cost on that. But to Juliette's point, the sustainability layer, that if you reduce cost, it immediately saves carbon in whatever sense, that they are seeing that as a big lever. And that is then bringing around discussions, which I get more and more excited about, which is, I think we'll find there's too much office space globally, and that's a controversial thing to say. I think that will free up space for other uses, which is a far more sort of macro level piece. But I am genuinely having conversations with corporate occupiers, and you're talking sort of Fortune 100 and FTSE 100 type organizations, that are then looking at, okay, so more people are working from home, and that means that some of those emissions related to home working sit within our responsibility. And we used to give people loans to commute into whatever city they were commuting into, or put on shuttle buses if you're in the US. But actually now, why don't we give people a loan to actually green, as it were, in inverted commas, their homes? Now, anyone actually implement that? But I just find it interesting from the real estate, commercial real estate, corporate real estate sphere, those sorts of discussions are even happening. And so it suddenly means you're making an effect well outside the four walls of your office, which for me feels very exciting.
In terms of what Sam has just said there, Juliette, from a Gensler perspective, in terms of that design piece that you guys are doing, is that resonating in terms of a shift that your practice has had before and sort of where we are now? Is that something that you're seeing in terms of that space or not?
Yeah, I think most of the RFPs that come through for Europe, certainly for London, are major retrofits and refurbishments. So we now have a specialist practice studio dedicated purely to that. And if you think about it, that makes total sense. It's becoming unjustifiable to build a new building in Northern Europe when there's so much build stock that can be refurbished, and the carbon savings that go with it, on average about 40%. We're less active in the residential space, so where we build residential, we're building to net zero standards, but that doesn't play to the kind of the country level domestic stock retrofit that Sam's talking about. If you move the workplace to the home and that home needing to be green, then that's really a requirement around moving away from gas domestic boilers and solar, and a lot of that's quite financially inaccessible for people. There's still quite a lot of pushback on air source heat pumps. So I think for the domestic occupier to finance what essentially is part of the energy revolution on their homes, that hasn't been clocked as something that sits as a responsibility in the corporate world. I think that's still very much on the homeowner and if it's a build-to-rent landlord.
And talk to me about that. And this is going off of the sort of the angle I was going on initially, because going back to my experience of what I'm seeing globally, everybody, and that's a sweeping generalization, so I'm going to caveat that a little bit. It's not everybody, but the majority of the industry is always talking about new. There's not enough talk about retrofit.
That's right. So anyway,
I also see that from all the work I used to do with Unisu, that the biggest challenge is finding solutions that are actually solving that retrofit problem. Is that still the case now, sort of moving several years on? Are there other things that the industry can be doing in terms of solving the retrofit issues that it's got? What are both of your opinions on that?
Sam?
I think retrofit is the main problem. I think, James, as we discussed last week, I mean, I think if you're building something new, you can be as innovative as you want. But to your point, Juliette, the real focus has got to be on the retrofit and what we do. I think the interesting thing, and it kind of comes on to what we were discussing sort of post-COVID, is the working week is totally different. It's no longer 5 days, Monday to a Friday. It's now you've got a 4-day weekend, really, in terms of occupancy within an office, because you've suddenly got Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. So what I'm also seeing, or what I'm seeing from an occupier perspective, them really looking at how their space is occupied, in particular on those days when nobody is there. We were talking about closing down, let's say you've got 10 floors, you close down 9 floors, everyone is on the ground floor, you close down the lifts, you save energy, you save costs, all those sorts of things. What we are then finding is that actually a lot of these buildings are designed for full occupancy, and you can't shut down floors in the same way as you would like, because of poor controls. Big is beautiful, great big chillers on the top, they have to keep running, and you're not really going down to only a tenth of the energy consumption. So I think the interesting thing that I think, when it comes to retrofit, I'm no sort of designer yet in terms of the actual solutions, but I think starting to retrofit for the use of that building, which is totally different than what it was 4 years ago, is something that is a great opportunity, but also changes the way those systems will be designed and therefore controlled in operations.
Yeah, I'd build on that. Got a colleague who says the most unsustainable building is an unused one, and I think there's something in that. But there's also the operational efficiency of those buildings, and we just need to be aware of spending embodied carbon to get operational efficiency. If we're running 100% renewables, there's a kind of perfect sweet spot in amongst all that. But what I would say is we're starting to see retrofit in markets like Dubai, Singapore, Canada, North America. So where there's mature built stock, and it's in the kind of life cycle of the 20, 30, 40, 50-year-old building, we're seeing preference towards retrofit. Again, driven by finance, driven by consumer demand. And in markets where we are building new, good example at the moment is clients in India, really being very demanding on new build embodied carbon emissions and operational emissions, but also resilience against climate risk, in their case extreme heat, but equally around drought, and in other places we see that around flooding. And so I think there are design responses that need to be contextual and nuanced. So where there's a developed market, we're seeing preference on retrofit coming still from the global finance industry and from occupiers. And then where there's new, there's really stringent and desire for low carbon impact properties.
Sorry, I missed that last bit, Juliette. Sorry, when we're talking about local, there's
desire for low carbon impact construction, including in the residential sector.
Yeah. And I think that's, sorry, James, just to jump in just on that, just to build, Juliette, on what you were saying, and you mentioned it before around the insurance sector. That's something we've really seen, is the effects that we all see whenever we turn on the weather forecast, but we see it out of our windows, both at home and in the office. The sort of extreme weather events and that risk associated with location and the requirement to adapt portfolios to climate change, that is rising right up the agenda, which again is building the momentum around actually sustainability as a whole, because people are seeing it now as a risk from a health and safety perspective, reputation, all that kind of thing. So that is really front and center, in particular in those geographies, Juliette, that you've touched on a few. But you know, if you take the US, that is seeing a lot of focus on this now.
But I mean, the US is a bit of a challenging side, right? Because legislatively wise, you've got a complete contradiction from a statewide legislation. So Florida versus California. I mean, they couldn't be polar opposite. Is that?
Sure.
Well, no,
but there are regions that are becoming uninsurable.
Yeah, Miami.
California.
Yeah.
When you say they're coming uninsurable,
becoming uninsurable in terms of you know, fire risk for a California profile and flood, storm damage for Florida.
Okay, so the traditional element of why you'd insure is now becoming a massive issue because of obviously the climate change exacerbating the challenges that these insurance area. Okay, all right, so that's a really interesting angle on the insurance bit, which I hadn't considered before, because obviously it's not, when I've looked at, and this is what I was about to come on to, what I see the carrot and stick approach to why there is a drive now at the moment for the industry to change. It's because insurers are wanting to know that you, in your portfolio, you have a strategy that's tackling ESG, and therefore they will insure. But actually what you're saying, there's the other angle there, which is it is just simply the fact that some geographical locations and areas mean that the risks associated to your portfolio are so severe that they won't insure. Okay, I hadn't considered that. Thank you. That's really useful. So,
and with that comes the devaluation of assets.
Of course. So it's a negative feedback loop entirely.
Potentially.
All right. So moving on to that, again, the carrot and stick side of why this is becoming such a driver. And I'll say this from my very ill-educated form of this, because I'm really picking this up very, very fast, but it's by no means where you guys are in terms of your knowledge on that. As far as I can see it, there are significant carrots in form of making changes, which is, it has been proven that obviously by having a strategy that is deployed in your buildings, it means that occupiers are more likely to occupy buildings. There is a slight rent uptick in terms of, you know, if your buildings are good for people, if they're good for the environment, then people will rent. There has been a carrot approach there. There's also a carrot approach in the sense of you can save energy, thus you can save money, which speaks to everything that the real estate industry is interested in, which comes down to money. But I'm going to put this out there and say that wasn't enough of an incentive for the industry to change. And so we're now seeing the stick approach coming in, which is much more around the legislative angle of reporting public listed companies and so on and so forth. Am I right to go down that line in this, which is we've got the incentive structure, which is okay, and then we have the sort of the potential fines that are going to be levied at the building level? Sorry, that's a very...
You're missing a point.
There. What's the point?
You're missing the major point, that we're living in an age of climate transition, and that's what's motivating it all.
Motivating whom?
Everybody. Isn't that what's underpinning this entire conversation?
I think it should be, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure it has been to this date.
Okay. Well, no, maybe not. But it feels simplistic to say, well, there's just push and pull around market forces, and it's in context. The context is that we're, in a major extinction event and massive unprecedented global warming, and so that's what's driving everything around the legislation and the carrot and the push and the pull.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, clearly, I would agree with that to a degree. But I guess when you go on a more tactical basis in terms of people making a decision, I think there are a number of factors. I think the sort of legislation piece of having to provide data for your end of year report, I think there are a number of bits to that. I think the fines do not particularly worry people. I think the reputational damage does. But having said that, and to your point, Juliette, and is linked to it, and I'm not saying the kind of fact we're in a climate emergency isn't driving some of this, because it is, obviously. But I think you've got a generation as well starting to come into the office that have grown up with this whole discussion. And you've got a soon to be retiring leadership, and I'm talking very generally, who are relatively new to this, and they lived in a world where sustainability wasn't a key driver. And that sort of attraction and retention of talent, certainly from my side, working with major businesses, that is also what is driving a lot of the change. Because in the end, offices in the grand scheme of that, to your reporting point, James, for a major corporate, be it finance, be it in technology, is actually a very small part of their overarching carbon footprint. But it is a really important part to be able to show off your sustainability credentials around great design and all the things that I'm sure Gensler do, because that is where employees, shareholders, stakeholders, frankly, come and visit. And so I think you'll actually find from a big corporate reporting perspective, if you're not a listed landlord, then actually offices, I hate to say it, are actually relatively minimal in that risk and immaterial in the grand scheme of the overarching footprint.
Okay, so let's go back to, and everything that you said there is aligns with where I was going with it, Sam, but I have to go back to what you said, Juliette, because that's why I love your way of putting things, because you challenge me, which is good. And I saw your email just coming through, which I'm just going to have a look at in due course.
I was trying to put it in the chat.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'll bring that in if you think, and it's around planetary boundaries. But your point is absolutely right, which is that is exactly how we should be looking at it, which is this is an extinction event. And that's where I'm sort of, I suppose I'm challenging myself, because that's absolutely the way that we should look at it. But I just don't know if wider society gets that, believes that, and understands that. Maybe understands before believes. And as a consequence, the real estate industry didn't see enough around the fact that they are the major contributor to this, and they have to make the significant change. And that is why the stickers had to come out and give them a massive, great big whack, because there are powers that be that genuinely do understand that the real estate industry, the built environment, has the most significant impact on this. And that's why they're having to put things in place to make them change. So I suppose that's why I'm looking at it as a push and a pull, because I don't think that the incentive to change, despite the fact that there's such a significant impact that this would have, I don't think it's changed the industry enough. And at the moment, we're having to start, so like CSRD, for example, and the other legislative structures we're going to have to follow are hitting, at the moment, the listed companies. But surely that sort of stuff is now going to filter through to every single business that we have. But it's still only starting at the very top. And I don't know if this is like an example of the ESG equivalent of trickle-down economics, where it's gradually going to come down to impact everybody. But at the moment, I suppose they're just hoping that it sets a precedent for everybody else to follow.
I think it does. I think that, for example, emission reporting, scope 1, 2, 3 emissions are becoming standard for corporates over a certain size, particularly in Europe. Our legislation is trailing a little bit. And then once you start to look at scope 3 emissions, that gets managed through the supply chain. So that presumably will scoop up everyone else anyway. So I think disclosure is like step one on this journey. And there's a big difference between being publicly listed and having people who can do those carbon calculations for you in annual reporting cycles. It's a big overhead. But what it will do is it will separate those who are able to show B Corp compliance or SBTI or compliance to 1.5 degree alignment from those who haven't publicly disclosed it. And so it will force a degree of alignment across the market over a period of time. which is why Mark Carney pushed it through GFANZ in the first place. Like the lever was through the finance industry to force everything to come alongside.
Your thoughts on all that, Sam?
Yeah, and I agree with that. Disclosure has always been a sort of key element of it, isn't it? And I think the other big driver, just thinking about it, is as part of that disclosure, to your point, Juliette, everyone's actually set targets, and so the customers, i.e. the consumers of space, office space, now have targets invariably that start to really kick in by 2030. So they're making decisions now around efficiency, carbon emissions, the availability, frankly, of data, which we haven't really touched on, which is still has not really progressed in the 15, 16 years that I've been doing sustainability. That's also what is driving the demand, and you will see some major property decisions being made with that sustainability lens, which links to their corporate targets ultimately.
Okay, we talked about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. I was at a conference in Macedonia, of all places, last year, and that really highlighted the challenges, I think, around scope 3, in the sense of the people in the room who were all real estate leaders hadn't really ever considered the scope 3 side and the supply chain issues. And I made a statement at that point saying that I felt scope 3 emissions are the biggest challenge the real estate industry has, because they've got absolutely no idea about their supply chain. Was that a fair comment to make now, sort of a year on? Are we almost sleepwalking into a challenge around, what we're meant to be reporting? Because I don't even know if the real estate industry understands its supply chain, let alone start to monitor it. So am I being unfair on that?
Sam, you might have an opinion. I'm happy to go. I mean, my view on it is it's going to be a major problem, and you're beginning to see scope 3 really be a core focus for occupiers. And from a real estate perspective, the embodied carbon piece is talked about a lot, but it is invariably ignored in the norm, in general terms. And I know, Juliette, you've talked about a number of good case studies, but I think, James, when you sort of started this right at the beginning, you can live in an echo chamber of people talking about how this is so important and how much it's changed. But that embodied carbon piece is still the wild west. And I think the true understanding generally around supply chains is really poor. And I say that on the context of also business as a whole, where you get pens from, paper, whatever it might be, is again incredibly poor. So, that scope 3 thing is really going to start to ramp up, and I'm seeing that already in terms of supply chain evaluation. A lot of the advice we're giving to certainly our occupiers.
I would say the emissions associated with materiality is getting better understood within the building industry. And the move to electrification of construction sites. So there is supply chain work going on. How consistent it is, and in terms of disclosure for reporting, I think people are getting comfortable with disclosing 1 and 2. Scope 3 is hard, and the potential for double counting in scope 3 is enormous. And the financial markets have acknowledged that. Purin Desai is an interesting person to talk to on this, because he...
Sorry, Juliette, can I just... When you say double counting in scope 3, can you just expand on what you mean by that? Just
if everybody in the supply chain is reporting their supply chain, then you've got the potential to mushroom scope. And so I think, Purin Desai was talking about this. He was talking about Alan Watts, and he said humans' response to this existential moment is to try and catalogue everything, to provide a kind of form of control. If we can count everything, catalogue everything, account for it, then somehow we've got our arms around it, and we've got the glide path to net zero. And it makes rational sense. But what it doesn't do is, and this is where the ecological design thinking course kicks in, trees aren't writing reports about their own canopy. And so there has to be a point where we as humans are able to refer back to our ability to make good decisions and have trust in our judgment again. Because this infinite commitment to accounting, frameworks, scopes, certification, and these things don't necessarily align, is mushrooming in complexity. So one of the focuses for COP this forthcoming COP is around finance and demystifying the amount of initiatives that there are, because it's now got hellishly complicated for anybody who hasn't got a lot of resources to navigate their way through this. And it changes by geography as well.
Arguably, we don't need to be the people's workshop.
So before I go on, the website that you shared with me, Planetary Boundaries, where does that come into this? Out of interest, I'm just going to share it so you, Sam, you can see this.
Yeah, I couldn't put it in the chat. Sorry, guys, but this is from Johan Rockstrom. So this is the Stockholm Resilience Centre for. It's Stockholm University doing research into where we are in terms of planetary boundaries. So when we talk about sustainability, what we're talking about is restoring equilibrium in the living systems that sustain life on Earth. So Johan Rockstrom's a famous climate researcher, and basically this what you're seeing is 2009 to 2023. And that, so in the lifetime that we've known about this, reported against it, disclosed it, written our reports, certificated things, we have still managed to cross 7 of the 9 planetary thresholds. So the green bit is the boundary upon which we can sustain life for all beings on Earth as we know it. The orange bit is where we're over our toes, over the rails on what can be kind of lived within. And so those orange pieces need to come back into green for us to live in a sustainable equilibrium planet. Now, this is essentially why it's so urgent. And very rarely do we have a real estate conversation framed within the context of how far over the rails are we. We talk about net zero by 2050, but even if we get to zero, the absorption of carbon out of the atmosphere will take another 180 to 200 years. So we need to be talking about regenerative. And every time we refurbish a building, build a building, we're using that carbon budget. So this is why the climate scientists are kind of grabbing the lapels and saying, hurry up. This is the why.
Yeah. And to balance that out, I was on Monday evening this week, I was at the inauguration of Tina Pellet as the new president of the RSES. And I've known Tina for a long time, and she set out her stall in terms of how the RSES is seeing their responsibility in this and driving all of their members, of which I think there's 135,000 around the world, and it's it's her single most important thing that she's going to address in her 1-year tenure. And it's annoying because for me, I don't know what you can do in 1 year. But I would hope that it would inform a narrative that will continue in further RSES sort of presidential candidates. But what was really impactful for me was we had Sir David King as an after, all the ceremony and pomp that goes with, handing over a brand new gold necklace to somebody. Actually, he came on and he gave a 30-minute, and I say this just in terms of leveling how clever he was and how engaged he was. No notes, no presentation slides, no nothing. And he stood there for 30 minutes and just talked about exactly the situation that we're in, talked a lot about what you've just sort of mentioned there, Juliette. And I found it absolutely riveting in terms of his direction. And then the sort of the return after that to, and this is the responsibility of where the built environment sits. You people in the room are 100% responsible for the decisions that we now make. And you need to go and sort this out. And it was a fascinating area for me to understand that importance. And and just to finish on this, and Sam, you already know this as well, but I made that decision to come out of the sort of the built environment sector, and actually I'm now put into this sort of ESG world. So for me, everything that you've said today, Juliette, Sam, has really helped me, not just in terms of my book research, but actually from a career perspective, because I feel I'm now hopefully contributing to resolving some of the challenges that we've had. I'm not going to take any more of your time because you've given me an awful lot to think about and consider through. Juliette, I know you're in a busy place, and I'm sorry for intruding in that, but genuinely thanks ever so much for your time. Sam, thanks ever so much. Obviously, we only met last week. You had some great views, and I've already taken a note of all the flex side and your attitudes around. In fact, actually, can you just give me a 30-second quick overview of that sort of flex sustainability? Because it was an interesting look at.
It comes back to the embodied carbon discussion. And Juliette, I'm sure this will resonate to a degree with you, but if you look, and the RACS thing, I could go bang on about forever, if I'm honest, James, another time. But
that's another one.
when you look at how leases used to be really long, and a corporate would take space for say 20 years, they would strip out what was there, they'd fit it out, and they'd then live in that space, maybe with a bit of a refresh over time. But invariably, that carbon, and I'm talking very generally, not scientifically, is then sort of amortized over quite a long period, and that is good. Lease lengths get shorter and shorter, and you've got this awful kind of stripping out, fitting out, stripping out, fitting out, basically with the same stuff, just in the different iterations. And so the wasted carbon from that embodied carbon piece is horrific. And also, it's only one organization using that space. So Flex provides a totally different, it de-risks it. So that's what we're seeing is the demand for Flex increasing, because for occupiers, suddenly COVID happens again, they've got to shut their offices. They'd rather be able to get out of space quickly, so they're not going to tie themselves to long leases. But it also means that it's stripped out once, it's fitted out once, and lots of different organizations and people come into the same space. Therefore, the embodied carbon is then reduced from the normal churn of continually stripping out, fitting out, stripping out, and fitting out. And that's before you start to refurb a whole building. So that's my view on it. And so, at the moment we talk about Flex and you talk about operators, and invariably people talk about Regis or IWG and WeWork. But actually, I just think it's just a different way of consuming space and frankly, ripping up the traditional lease and doing something different with it.
Yeah. Okay. That's thanks for putting that succinctly, because I know we talked around it a lot last week. Anyway, thank you very, very, very much for your time. I really appreciate it. I'm going to end that stream now anyway, but publicly, thanks.